Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Change the Balance podcast and YouTube channel, where we are opening up hearts, minds and souls to explore the challenges, barriers and opportunities available to leaders who are creating safe and inclusive spaces, with Sabrina, Shadie, ethics and equity specialist, and Charlotte, Hopkins, learning and development specialist. And together with our guest, we will be sharing our own personal journeys, lots of inspirational stories and top tips on how we are becoming better allies that help to tackle stigma, prejudice and discrimination head on. And today we're going to be talking about systemic discrimination. And if you've been following us in this series, you'll know that we've had a thread go out through all of our episodes that looks at that trauma and the impact that trauma can have on various different people that have been subjected to prejudice or discrimination. And one of the things that, as somebody who doesn't really sit within any of the boxes that you see within our statistical kind of reports, is that this idea of systemic disadvantage is something that is very, very real. And I wanted to just share this kind of idea of what we mean by this systemic disadvantage, and then we're going to have a conversation around that, because I'll be honest with you, I wasn't really sure I could see it. And I've talked openly about the fact that it's taken me a really long time to see that gender inequality as a female, but also I could see it on a very surface level, but never really to a point where it was disadvantaged. So I knew systemic racism took place. I knew systemic discrimination towards people with disabilities, for example, took place. I didn't really understand that systemic disadvantage. And it kind of looks at this deeply embedded social structure that compromises outcomes for health and safety, education, and also the legitimacy of the narrative. Mm-hmm. And it was that final bit that really captured my imagination, because the legitimacy of the narrative really plays into that role of an ally. But first off, I'm going to throw over to my business bestie and talk a little bit about what we mean by systemic disadvantage.
Yeah, so historically, it's really easy to see when you can plot the history of, let's say, the British Empire, but most of the European countries had empire of some kind or other. And the British Empire became really rich through its process of discrimination, where it went around the world and took resources in the form of people, in the form of real natural resources, you know, cutting down trees, building farms, whatever.
Diamonds.
yeah, exactly. Running plantations. And it literally went around the world, taking over countries, stripping them of their assets and their resources, and made itself really, really rich. At the same time as doing that, it degraded those humans who came from those different parts of the world. So that sort of systemic disparity in value in terms of the British person who was born in Britain, seeing themselves as being much more highly valued than the people from what we would now consider maybe the Commonwealth. I'm not a fan of the term, but for want of a better word, people who come from the Commonwealth who are not seen as properly British.
Yeah.
But yet when you look back historically, even in the last few decades, a lot of the people who came over through Windrush, people coming from Jamaica were British citizens. They came on British passports. They were not foreigners. Culturally, education system matched the UK education system. They all spoke English. They're all primarily Christian. So Britain actually took its culture and implemented it all around the world. But the disparities in how it viewed those people who come from those countries that built its wealth, there's a massive disparity. So they didn't get the same access to education. They didn't get the same access to healthcare, although they funded and, actually ran, in a lot of cases, those services. So for me, the legitimacy part is actually that you coming from those colonies, you could never legitimately be British. And we saw that in the recent conversation between the lady, I can't remember, the royal lady from the royal family talking to a black British, I think she's a charity worker, and she's like, "Oh, where are you really from?"
Okay.
She's like, "Oh yeah, no, I'm British." And I know where you like, as if you can't be British and of color or black
Yes.
or
Yeah.
whatever. And we see these things happen quite a lot. So that legitimate part is really interesting, because the British system is built on disparity. So the only way to justify the trade in enslaved people was to make them not people.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
cargo. So you dehumanize those people, and we're seeing it now with the refugee and asylum seeker conversations. They're dehumanized. We talk about invasion, talking about likening them to rodents or insects, or something that makes them less than human, so it's okay to treat them in a way that is not humanitarian.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really the whole conversation around immigration is really interesting, because we've opened out, and in Wales in particular, we're looking and actively searching for family hosts for Ukrainian refugees, but the idea that they're just temporary, so therefore they're not a burden,
but they're also not being treated as asylum seekers. The process for the Ukrainian
exactly that,
immigrants is not the same process as anybody other coming in, and we're not part of Europe anymore, so that is no longer a justifiable reason.
And I think that's the thing, and I wonder whether kind of part of the challenge with systemic discrimination is we're very good at individual. So individual to individual, we don't see that direct discrimination as much anymore. I mean, it's there, of course, but we don't,
not as obvious.
So that from an individual to individual, we almost have that compassion. And I think there's something about this kind of group level, really, this idea, this blanket ban of them and us. And I think dehumanization is a really great way of describing it. And I guess the challenge I have is that where in those systems do we see that discrimination? And that was part of the kind of awakening for me, is unless you dig into it, you just don't see it. As I think, as a white person. Now, somebody put on my post a couple of posts ago that everybody is racist of some kind, and we need to learn and unlearn that. And I take that on board. As we've talked about a couple of podcast episodes ago, I don't believe that many white people have experienced firsthand, directly or indirectly, racism, for example. Yes, they may have experienced the disadvantage of, certainly not being able to get on a train as and when you want to get into Cardiff city centre and home. It becomes much more of a challenge. But I think we can empathise with that a lot more. I think there's something there that I really love to explore a bit more about the systemic disadvantage that people of colour experience. And I guess in particular, Black people.
Absolutely. And I think your example about the Ukrainian refugees is really key. Legitimate narrative. It's really easy for people in the UK. They've obviously found that the story of what happened in Ukraine fully legitimizes the narrative of making space for those people here. We don't have the same that legitimization of the narrative for Syrian refugees or Afghanistani refugees. We don't have that. They're not legitimate. They're actually being called illegal. Which is really, that to me is a really high profile example. In terms of the impact for people, particularly Black people, particularly people who I would say Caribbean background, because UK owned a lot of the Caribbean. Caribbean's independence, we're only celebrating sort of 50 odd years in some places of independence, which is not very long in the history of how rich Britain got from those spaces. And the discriminatory part is that if you build a society that the wealth and power is generated from the exploitation of the workforce, and that's not just in terms of the plantations and the enslavement of people, that process, but actually if you look at how Britain ran India, Kenya, parts of South America, it's the same principle. It's exploitation of workforce, indentured labor, You need to find those, you need to build those disparities into the system to maintain the wealth and power structures. That's not changed. Nothing significant has changed in all of those decades to undermine any of that. And we see that, you know, a young kid in school being challenged for his behavior. So when my daughter was in school, there's a young lad in the same class as her, and the teacher kept saying to me, then the teacher was from, I think she was from Iran. She was saying to me, oh, this boy, you know, she's British born, but you know, diaspora from Iran. She was saying, oh, this boy, his behaviour, I'm gonna have to exclude him. And obviously I'm from an educational background, inclusive education. And I said to her, you know, would you allow me to come and spend a couple of mornings with him? Yeah, as a parent support, you know, I've got a DBS and all of that, can I come?
Yeah.
And I spent literally the first morning I went in and worked with him, and this kid's just too bright. His behavior was disruptive. It wasn't actually involved anybody else. He would just want to do something, because still just wasn't his nature. And you know, this kid, you know, from a good family, his parents both GPs, so smart, capable, you know, fairly good family input, but sitting still wasn't his thing, and he was bored. The teacher wasn't moving at a pace enough to keep him engaged. So I just gave him some activities to keep his hands busy, and we sat, and as the teacher's teaching the rest of the class, I'm asking him what's going on, like, can he answer the questions, does he understand what's happening? Fully understood while he was doing another activity. So he's literally multitasking. And he was, you know, we ended up writing a program to get him one-to-one support and funding for the one-to-one support. He is now in Dubai running his own business at 20 years old. But he nearly got excluded because of his boredom. It was seen as misbehavior, seen as disruptive, seen as troublesome. If he hadn't have been a black boy, would that have been the first port of call? Would be they're talking about excluding him. They hadn't assessed him. No one had come and done any one-to-one work with him, but his classroom teacher, and his kids are about, I think they were about 6 or 7 at the time. So it's not like his disruptive behavior was damaging to anybody. He wasn't throwing chairs across rooms or anything like that. He was just being seen to not be concentrating, but no one was even checking that he understood, because his actual comprehension of what was taking place
was really good. And I think it's really interesting, because automatically my initial thought, and I'm sure I won't be the only one listening in, my initial thought was, well, yeah, of course a white boy would have been treated exactly the same. Like that doesn't give, just because he's, you know, not white, he's got brown skin, doesn't mean that it's any different. And then actually, when I look at the research, we know that education system tends to be overly punitive. So we have less tolerance for poor behavior in people of color, black people. And I think this is what's really interesting to me, the whole conversation. And again, I can only talk as a white woman, and I've got lots of friends who are, what a better word, brown skin. And they will also say that they have not really experienced some of the systemic racism that happens within schools that a brown boy in particular will experience. And I think those rules that are overly rigorous or overly punitive, for one, the impact then is that the reaction is much more harsh and is much more severe. We then see that impact in terms of the criminal justice system, for example. Now, not all black boys or black girls will go into the criminal justice system, but when we look at those wider inequalities, that's the bit, it was that ripple effect that I just wasn't seeing.
If you look at we call it the like school to prison pipeline, and it's really popular in America. You can see a real clear, and I think you can here as well. If you look at the numbers of young people from particularly black, in terms of British Caribbean families, who are excluded for behavior, when actually when you look at the behavior, it's very, very nominal. It's like stuff that other kids wouldn't get in, you know, the same response. They get excluded from school much more quickly. They have much more many fewer chances. They're not given options and options and options and options. It's like literally 3 strikes and you're out kind of thing, whereas other kids maybe get a bit more leeway. There's not the consideration for the cultural differences. So,
yes, absolutely.
That we had a whole incident when I was first training as a youth worker, where we worked with the police, and the police officer was going to me, oh, you know, these bloody Somalian kid, you know, I'm trying to talk to him and he wouldn't look me in the eye, and I kept saying to him, look in my face, I'm trying to talk to you, and he kept looking at the ground. I'm like, you're literally asking him to challenge you to a fight, because culturally we don't look our authority figures in the eye. That's literally, it's a direct challenge. Culturally, that's not something that we do. I'm not Somalian, but you know, in terms of a wider sort of culture. And this police officer was like, yeah, but I needed to know that he was understanding. I said, he was showing you he was understanding by looking at the floor in deference to you, going, I'm accepting your authority.
Yeah.
This is me showing you that deference. But the police, and you know, the more you're shouting at him, the more you're saying to him, fight me, and he's going, I don't want to fight you. You know, and you're just like,
I can't afford to fight you. And it's not,
exactly.
I think that's the thing. It's not even, you know, it's not even just, I don't want to. I can't afford to look at you in any which way that might be perceived as wrong, because you're already shouting at me.
Exactly. And like in my family, you know, you would, if my nan's telling you off, you don't look in her face. You know, you do. You kind of look at the floor, you look at your feet. You're not looking in her eye. You look in her eye, you're likely to get the backhand of concrete. You know, that all grandmothers seem to be able to whip out of the slightest need. But you know, that wasn't culturally. He and this police officer just hadn't realised that he was goading this young person, and culturally just completely misread the situation. And I think those kinds of discriminatory practices, because of lack of knowledge and lack of understanding, have such detrimental and traumatic impact on the young people long term, because you know, they get kicked out of school, they're hanging around on the street, they're seen to be a problem because they're hanging around, not necessarily committing any crimes, just loitering and being a nuisance. Because apparently young people are supposed to be not seen and heard. I thought we'd move past that by this.
Well, if you wear a hoodie, you must be trouble.
And then, you know, become known to the police because they're out on the street, and then it slowly, you know, it escalates, and they end up with a criminal record for not really having done anything very much other than struggle to get the education, or to get what they need out of the education system. And yeah, you can actually track that. There is quite a lot of evidence, a lot of research around that kind of school exclusion into criminal justice process, because there isn't a mechanism to pick those young people up, or actually to stop them being excluded in the first place. And there's lots of, we're talking about in terms of Black, particularly Caribbean young people, but actually we see very similar process for young people who are not diagnosed in terms of their neurodivergence and stuff. We can see a similar kind of track taking place for them as well.
The whole thing, I think the school system is really, we could probably talk forever on the school system and how it's not necessarily fit for purpose for 90% of the young people that go through. And I think it's that long-term ripple effect, isn't it? So we know that if you come out with lower GCSEs, you don't have the financial stability that you may need. There's not the employment issues that are there. You then have you know, that family dynamic that causes some contention. And I think what's been interesting, one of the conversation I was having with somebody a couple of weeks ago, was around the language, and we were laughing at the way that the previous BBC reporter had spoken. It was proper clipped English, and there was no dialect really on TV and the radio. It was all just very proper English. And as a Welsh person, we absolutely get, you know, certainly have a stereotype where we're a little bit stupid and called tup in Wales, because of the dialect. And I think there's something there about that cultural expectation, and whether that links to kind of immigration, or whether that links to being Black British, for example, or whether it starts to vary on classism, and we start to talk about just that ability
I think the socioeconomic impact is always underlying. I don't think we can ever really get away from it, or completely separate those topics in reality.
And I think, you know, when we talk about, certainly from you know, where we are financially at the moment, and that kind of poverty line is a very fine line, and the barriers between the rich and the poor are still extreme.
Probably the biggest they've been in recorded history. currently.
Yeah, but I think we've got this squeezed middle as well. So these people who have worked really hard to conform, to get into these roles of, teaching, and typically white middle class roles. Social work is typically white middle class, teaching, typically white middle class, engineering, white middle class. When we look at those roles, then what we have is this level of elitism. What we now have, though, is this middle group of people who are nurses and doctors and social workers who also have no income stability because of the cost of living rise. So things have kind of become a bit more of a messy jumble of systemic issues, but we still don't see the prejudice that we do within certain groups.
When you add the socioeconomic part to the conversation and you recognize that if you are, I'm going to use this disability as an example because I think that's one a lot of people can relate to quite easily. If you're somebody who has a disability, your cost of living is already something like 60% higher than the average person because your health requires you to have additional expenditure, be that so my daughter used to have an electric wheelchair. The annual service on that is nearly £100. So you've got to find £100 out of your PIP or whatever to cover that additional cost once a year. And that's just a really obvious one. That's not including adaptive clothing or adaptive transport or how many days you've got to take off a year to go to your hospital visits and the transport to get you to the hospital visits.
Suitable housing.
Yeah, exactly. Having your stuff down to your house. If you own your house, you may not get the funded support to have bits and pieces added. There's so many hoops you've got to jump through to prove we're back to that proof, the legitimate narrative to prove your eligibility for the support that allows you to live in a way that is conducive to your well-being and your engagement with society. So now if you look at people from ethnic minority immigrant families, where generally you find them in poorer housing because coming into a country you start at the bottom, you don't normally get to come in with all of you don't normally come in with loads and loads of resources and assets, very rarely. So you come in at the bottom, and that's including housing. Housing is a really massive one when we talk about disparities of how people who have protected characteristics really struggle to get out of that temporary housing cycle. Privately rented or council or social housing, that churn of never really having more than maybe 12 months security at any given time because your landlord, whoever they may be, can withdraw that. So you often do not have families where they've been very stable because the landlord's decided they're going to sell the house out from under you, so you've got to find somewhere else. But there's no, the council list is obviously overflowing, so you've got to find another private rent, and this constant churn actually puts you in a survival mode place. So how much can you concentrate on building your assets and working past the discrimination if you're always faced with these socioeconomic challenges?
And it's like a chronic fatigue. It's exhausting. Like you're not sleeping properly, you're not you're not eating properly, do I pay the bills, do I feed my children? So that the cortisol levels that are naturally flowing, there's possibly not a huge amount of dopamine unless it's stress related. So when you look at the health inequalities, you can really see how all of those play in to its part. So before we even look at the practicalities of, okay, you've done a crime, you've been naughty in school, before we even look at that, we're talking about families who probably have stressed parents, who are probably not as healthy as they can be. We now know from kind of the neuroscience research that's been taking place, the impact that, the body keeps the score. So when we know that storing that trauma and that stress within our body and our minds is exhausting. And I put a call out to any new mums or anybody that's just got a new puppy or kitten, because it is bloody exhausting.
Sleep deprivation is used as a form of torture for a reason.
Oh my word.
It's not a joke. sleep
It is
deprivation.
really not. I am not the most patient of people when I'm hungry, and I am definitely not the most jolly of people. And I'm jolly most times, but I'm definitely not the most
Sleep
jolly of times
deprivation
when
just
I'm,
ruins life,
yeah.
like it really does.
And it takes quite a lot to get sleep deprived. And I think that's the bit for me. It's the idea that this behavior is different to other people. So, you know, if they're acting out, for example, there's this like, oh, they're not conforming, they're not doing what I want them to do, so they're deviant. No, they're just bloody exhausted,
Absolutely.
hungry, stressed,
Mm-hmm.
got no money, got a child who's being kicked out of school, even though they've probably prepared themselves and their children for this systemic disadvantage, which we've talked about in a previous podcast. Like, all of these things
And
are
that
a
compounded
massive
trauma,
compounded thing.
which
And I
then
wrote,
affects behaviour, which then affects our ability to perform in the workplace.
and
And
outcomes. And I wrote down a list of all the things where I have researched, because this was a big mind opening for me. And the economic structure was the first thing that set it off. But actually, that disadvantage came from generalized oppression, which we know, we've talked about lots, poverty, education, employment, residential. So things like living in the rural area versus the city.
mm-hmm.
If you're in a city, people often think you've got more resources. You kind of have, but there's also a bigger dense of people accessing them. So there kind of isn't.
Yeah.
And I'm fortunate enough to live in a city, but I've worked in some of the most affluent parts of Wales, and the resources there are no different to the resources. There's just the same demand in both. Financially, at least I can afford to get on the bus to go to the support services. Because if I lived in the middle of what we call Vale of Glamorgan, which is quite rural, I may need to get 1 or 2 buses that I can't really afford. And yes, a lot of support services will pay the bus fare, but they don't pay that bus fare until you're there.
Until you're there, you have to have the cash in the first place to get on the
And a
bus to get
receipt.
there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when we look at the idea of intergenerational, the opportunities, the health, the lack of value, the legal system, social care, the violence that is kind of self-perpetuating in so many communities as well as those kind of stress levels.
And I
I
think we see
cannot.
direct correlation between poverty and cost of living and increase in violent crime. Like historically, we can see there's a direct correlation between those things. So we're expecting to see an increase in violent crime being reported in the next couple of years.
If you were in a position where, as a young person, you got offered £1,000 for doing a quick run down the country as a drug runner or a knife runner, or a £50 for working a 40-hour week on an apprenticeship scheme, I mean, come on. What choice for some of these young people, what choice do they feel that they have? So yes, there is always a choice. Sometimes that choice is not easy.
And you know, it's even bigger than that. I've worked with young offenders quite a lot for quite a long period of time, and we had quite a lot of scenarios where, and you can see there's actually evidence that's come out in the last couple of weeks. So there's one where a family, their child died because they lived in the mold from the flat they lived in, even though they reported it over and over again. And it's you know, the racism that was systemic in the fact that they did not get the support and their child did not get the care required. Even though they took the child to hospital, the child was sent back into the environment, and no follow-up. You know, there was no plan, and the child ended up dying. This is a tiny little toddler. Not even, I think she was still under a year or something. And that correlates really closely with the fact that I think there's 3 times fewer black homeowners in the UK. Which is, that's just, how are we not providing equality enough so that people can buy their homes? And we see these situations happen quite a lot. Like my mum wasn't able to buy her housing association house because the fact she lived there so long meant she'd get such a discount that they didn't see it as profitable to sell it to her, so they refused. So she wasn't allowed to get on the housing ladder in that way. She did eventually, but in that moment they took all her options away, so she would never be able to be a homeowner. And it's like there's so many of these kinds of scenarios, but the whole the disparity on disparity. So the health, NHS treated that baby and her family in a way that was, it looks like in court it's going to be decided that it was a racist decision that was made. It was based in that disparity that we've been talking about. The housing situation, that they're in a mouldy house that's not being processed, potentially has the discrimination around that, because nobody should live in those kinds of environments. So it's those compounded elements built on and on and on and on that cause somebody to actually die. But it shouldn't take a child dying for us to be able to undo and unpick and recognize the disparities that people actually having to live through and try and battle against.
And I think that's the bit. So, and this is where I come back full circle with I don't see the systemic discrimination. And I think that's because we look at it in silo. So we look at it and go, no, that person didn't make a disco. Like, if that had been a white baby, then they would have had the same thing because the housing stock is still the same. The fact that we compounded all of those things, that's what makes it discriminatory and systemically discriminatory. So we're going to move on, and our next episode is looking at personal capital and social capital that comes from experiencing discrimination. And it's such an important topic to really do, because there are strengths that come from people who experience these things. And that's how the resilience is built. But when we look at the intergenerational impact and how many barriers there are to overcome, I defy anybody to keep fighting that hard all the time. And this is where we start to look at things like conformity. And this is where we start to look at code switching, and we start to really have to look at how we play the game. And I'm really curious, and like, we won't be able to talk about it in this one because we've talked for quite a while already. But please join us for the next episode, because we'll be talking about how playing the game does help. But why should we be playing a game in the first place? That's the question. And as with anybody, you need to have somebody who tends to control the games. And that's surely the people we should be challenging, not those playing the games. The game makers are the ones that need to be tweaking what's happening. And I think when we look at that systemic disadvantage, then we really can see how the game makers play a massive impact, I think, in our lives.